Essence magazine once described Mariah Carey as America's most misunderstood black woman. In this series, we'll be examining that statement. Hi, I'm Diva Talk and welcome to the channel. It's hard to explain. Inherently, it's just always been strange. Neither here nor there. Always somewhat out of place everywhere. Somewhere halfway. Feeling there's no one completely the same. These are the lyrics of Mariah Carey's song Outside. It highlights so well the complicated obsession with Mariah's race during her debut.
Oh, this is a white girl, she sounds black. Oh no, it's a black girl, but she isn't, she's white. No, she isn't, I think she's mine, I think she's one, I think she's a... So, what are you?
Notice Oprah doesn't ask Mariah who she is, but what she is.
My mother is Irish, a person first and foremost. My mother is Irish, my father is Venezuelan and black.
Okay.
So I'm the
You have heard it here. Would y'all please stop discussing this girl's race?
Billboard notes publications from the LA Daily News to Playboy and the Herald Sun described her as white throughout 1990. The Australian Herald proclaimed she was the new white soul singer of our time, dismissing one half of her family background. Some in the media declared Mariah was a second-class Whitney Houston. There were heated discussions regarding a supposed white woman singing a more soulful version of music, especially when many black artists in the 80s were forced to sing pop. Mariah became increasingly frustrated, yet the media misrepresented this as an emotional overreaction. Now, to understand the complexities of these matters, we need to look at the cultural context. The 80s had just ended. During this time, the relationship between race and music, particularly MTV, was problematic. The king of pop himself, Michael Jackson, initially was rejected from MTV. The channel claimed songs like Billie Jean were just not rock enough to be aired. Was this a cover for not being white enough? To use rock as an example is, well, it's suspect, given the founding fathers of rock and roll such as Chuck Berry and Little Richard were iconic black artists.
That's what's happening. We're being sat in the back of the bus television style.
President of CBS Records eventually gave MTV an ultimatum. Play Jackson's records or we'll pull every single artist we have from your station. CBS were successful, and Michael Jackson eventually dominated not just MTV, but the world. And in another sphere going on at the same time, you had veteran soul divas like Aretha Franklin, Gladys Knight, Patti LaBelle. They were all moving towards a commercial pop sound. Why? In order to survive. And often with great success. Patti scored her first #1 since Lady Marmalade, duetting with Michael McDonald on My Own. And Aretha launched an enormous major comeback into mainstream music.
Best R&B vocal performance, female. Aretha Franklin, Freeway of Love.
Also going on in the same period was the one and only, The Voice, Whitney Houston. The soon-to-be legend was specifically instructed to downplay her gospel-orientated vocals on her studio recordings. Clive Davis from Arista wanted Houston to have a crossover sound that didn't alienate the majority white audience by sounding too soulful. And as a result, Whitney soared to the top of the charts, not once, not twice, but 7 times. 7 consecutive #1s, a record that has never been broken. And yet, simultaneously, she was booed at the Soul Train Awards for sounding too white.
Friction at the Soul Train Awards. Where does that come from? For those of you who don't know,
They boo me at Soul Train Awards. I don't really know what it's about, but I think that I've got a lot of flack, about I sing too white, or I sing white or something like that, I don't either, but I do sing the way God intended for me to sing, and I'm using what he gave me, and I'm using it to the best of my ability.
It was an era when singing pop was almost essential to survive. And then, in the summer of 1990, as the heat began to rise on a new decade, a debut single was released that shattered the status quo of pop and replaced it with a far more diverse sound. Although the big hair of the decadent 80s remained, The corporate pop sound of MTV was crumbling like sand under the weight of a soulful exploration, and although Mariah was not the first to do so, she quickly became the champion of runs and riffs and a strong R&B influence into her music. And unlike Whitney, who often ad-libbed more soulful interpretations live in her concerts, Mariah's debut contained these sounds and were being sent to radio. The times were changing. The media zoned in on this. Mariah was helping to bring the triumphant sound of urban music that dominated the 70s from funk to disco and delivered into a new decade. But there was one massive problem.
I don't feel white.
Mariah was not this fresh new white soul singer for a new generation. And to understand this, and why it's so fundamentally wrong, we need to go back to Mariah's youth and to a childhood dominated by trauma.
You've been traumatized your whole life. You were raised in a family of chaos.
I would say troubled. I would say traumatized.
My husband said something, my ex-husband said something that made an impression on me. Before we got married, I said to him, what about children and I said, what's going to happen with our children? And he said, any child of mine is going to be discriminated against. When we were eating one night, someone shot through the window.
But what I felt was that no friend, nobody I grew up with, nobody in school could even come close to relating to my experience because you feel different. I wrote a song about it on the Butterfly album called Outside, and it's about feeling ambiguous and without a sense of belonging, like,
Oh, this is a white girl, she sounds black. Oh no, it's a black girl, but she isn't, she's white. No, she isn't, I think she's mine, I think she's white, I think she's a... So, what are you?
In part 1, we examined the controversy surrounding Mariah's debut, entering the music scene in the pop-dominated MTV years. Incorrectly branded a white soul singer, in part 2 we'll be looking at her challenging childhood as a mixed-race girl.
I felt, inside, and I never really expressed it to very many people, like I wasn't good enough, like I was, I didn't look like one particular group or another.
In her 2020 memoir, The Meaning of Mariah, the singer makes an unusual dedication, offering the book in large part to finally emancipate the scared little girl inside her as she experienced it. And, if I'm being honest, Mariah had merit to be afraid in her youth. Her father was black, with Venezuelan lineage. Her mother was white, with Irish lineage. Mariah was born in 1970. That's only 3 years after the US Supreme Court ruled that laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional. Such laws still existed in 16 states.
We advance the argument that these statutes are slavery statutes. A state may not pass a law which proscribes marriage between two consenting, competent adults based on race alone.
The couple divorced when Mariah was a toddler. Her sparse memories of the marriage involve a household full of tension that often overspilled into violence. She recalls her father and unstable brother fighting in her living room, and when the police finally arrived, they brought with them a sense of dread, not aid. As Mariah writes, it was Long Island in the 1970s. 2 black men were being violent. The appearance of the police almost never meant that help had arrived. This sense of futile despair that lived within the mind of a toddler is heartbreaking. A child should not have to experience such heavy burdens, and yet they were commonplace. Mariah was not yet 4 years old. The unrest in the house could be so severe that Mariah would stay awake all night, fearful that when sleeping something horrendous would happen, and to this day Mariah has stated she prefers to work at night. Mariah's parents worked hard so the family could live in an affluent white neighbourhood.
I thought, well, it's a more affluent area. Maybe we will be accepted by this group of people. And of course that was the worst.
And yet, the mother would often leave the house first, ahead of her black husband and mixed-race children, for their safety.
And one of our dogs was poisoned.
The outcome was often not a feeling of safety, but segregation. More distressing was that this permeating force of partition also resided within Mariah's heart. As she was part black, her mother's white relatives disowned the family, and as a result she was raised feeling like an outcast, a mistake, the other. Her father was wrongfully accused of raping a white woman, and although exonerated, it left huge emotional scars. Oppression was literally woven into her household.
They asked us to draw a picture of our family, and so I was drawing everybody and filling everybody in, and I got to my father and I started to make him brown, and the two women were standing behind me giggling, and I turned around like, self-conscious, like, why are you laughing? And they said, you're doing that wrong. Why are you making your father the wrong color?
On one occasion, when Mariah was dropped off to her dad's house by her mother, she brought along a friend, and as the door creaked open and her father became visible, the white friend stood there shocked and started sobbing. Why? Because she was scared by the presence of a black adult man. It defined the major difference Mariah felt. On another occasion, Mariah was invited to the Hamptons with friends. When she arrived, the so-called friends cornered her, repeatedly shouting the N-word in a chant of shame and humiliation. Unable to escape the secluded area that took 2 hours to drive to, Mariah was trapped in a house of unhidden and unbridled racism, a haunting experience she admitted was internalized for years. Simply for who she was, independent of her character. She was disliked because she was Mariah. And yet, in spite of the racial intolerance, Mariah was still viewed as not being black enough in other circles. Her siblings resented her for having lighter skin and claimed she was passing. As Carey only lived with a white mother, her siblings thought it was easier than living with a black father, but of course, nothing was easy about Mariah's childhood, which included neglect, mental health struggles, and routine taunting from her peers who viewed her as a mongrel. Mariah felt like she never belonged to her own group, her own tribe. She was innately different, and her legitimate tribe, her siblings, detested her for having lighter skin. Even more heartbreaking is the fact that Mariah did not grow up surrounded by her black relatives to offer support. Her parents' ongoing conflict post-marriage prevented this, and therefore, Mariah was unaccepted by white America and unacknowledged by her black family.
And I miss you, a little sis, a little brother.
And one of her cousins summed up this traumatic childhood when she poignantly informed Mariah that she had all the burdens of being black with none of the benefits. The lyrics of her song Close My Eyes, when looked through the prism of her unstable childhood, are bleak and distressing. To have been effectively ostracised from both sides of her life is tragic. But to then have her painful childhood dismantled in the media through the narrative that Mariah was a simple white soul singer is particularly saddening. But that was the belief by many. Mariah was claimed to be a Caucasian beauty who had soul, almost like a Taylor Dayne or Tina Marie. She was fundamentally viewed as a white artist. And yes, she was celebrated, but because of this, she was not without her critics. She often was reduced to being a second-rate Whitney Houston or another white girl trying to exploit black music for her own gain. As a result, Mariah's lived experience, her traumatic childhood, was sometimes dismissed. Now, let's take a step back. Mariah was a mixed-race girl who was bullied for years for being too black in her youth. She was now being whitewashed as a Caucasian beauty who was taking advantage of the music many black singers couldn't utilise in the pop-dominated 1980s. Mariah arrived into the music world as a perfectly manicured baby diva, and many saw her as coming from a place of power, glamour, privilege. Mariah resided in a landscape where acceptance was denied from multiple demographics. It seemed as though there were knives out, ready to tear her apart in all sections of society, and yet, in spite of the complicated, racially charged politics that attached themselves to her music, Vision of Love, her debut song, was still a huge success.
And I was surrounded by super, uber powerful people.
Because it really isn't a pop record. It was slightly whitewashed.
Mariah's first single, Vision of Love, was both critically and commercially successful. It spent 4 weeks at #1 in the US and was nominated for multiple Grammys, including both Song of the Year and Record of the Year. It became a major influence on a range of later singers. Beyoncé claimed the song made her want to be a singer. Interestingly, Mariah won for Best Female Vocal Performance, but the category was not in R&B, it was in pop. Now, if aliens landed down from Mars and asked me to play a pop song, Vision of Love would never cross my mind. Yes, the song was popular, but it didn't reside within the genre of pop. Mariah has stated herself, she wrote it from an R&B place and it was geared towards that kind of R&B sound.
So it was geared for an R&B audience, and that's where I wrote it, from that place.
It's also important to note that Vision of Love went to #1 on the R&B chart, which at the time was called the Black Chart, before it peaked in the pop world. This definitely was a song which, in part, finally acknowledged in a positive way her father and her black roots, which were so often tarnished with shame. Mariah was making music that celebrated urban sounds in a confident, celebratory fashion. However, the label, shocker, were adamant that Mariah would be portrayed as a non-threatening girl next door, fundamentally white. And although Vision of Love fought hard against that ideal, the label pressured Mariah into recording more middle-of-the-road pop ballads in order to whitewash her, and as a result, her next single, Love Takes Time, took a more calculated, safe route.
After that, it was like, we need another pop ballad. I know how to do that too. Like, I know how to write down the middle. Like, I get it. So when you're asked and you're a 19-year-old girl, well, we need another pop ballad. They want a simplistic ballad. I wrote Love Takes Time. It's cute and it'll do what it needs to do. And
as a result, it's not surprising that Vision of Love would be incorrectly categorized as pop, because this was no mistake. This was the agenda. The agenda of executives to crush one half of Mariah's identity for monetary success. Her third single, Someday, also fell into the same murky water. The original demo that Mariah conceived was, quote, funky and one of her favourite songs. However, the label, in Mariah's opinion, overproduced the track, and what we can see is a singer with legitimate talent, both vocally and in terms of songwriting, that was fighting hard against a machine that wanted to camouflage her mixed race and, more importantly, black identity. Now, one of the more interesting turns in Mariah's career is her follow-up album, the deeply underrated Emotions. On this project, and off of the huge success of her debut, Mariah was given far more creative control. She fought hard to include 70s-inspired disco, funk, even jazz inspiration on some songs. And this was not just a straightforward pop album, it took what I believe Vision of Love did by amalgamating and celebrating the cultural melting pot that lived within Mariah and tackled multiple genres.
Right, well, Emotions was my first effort as a producer. I co-produced the whole album, and it was a lot of fun, but more importantly, it really gave me a chance to be very intricately involved in every aspect of the recording, and I loved it.
However, although many of these songs, including the title track or the gospel-influenced Make It Happen, went on to become signature Mariah tracks within the Lamely universe, the album underperformed. It sold considerably less, charted only one #1 single instead of 4, and in fact, Tommy Mottola, the head of Columbia Records, pulled the second single from the shelves in order to drive up sales of the album. Now, there are many reasons why Emotions underperformed. There was controversy towards some of the samples used, which led to legal cases. Some argue it was just too soon after the debut and that the fire was still burning from her first album, which overshadowed her second. And some will argue that the taste at the time just did not like Mariah Carey's soaring, high-octane vocals. But what is very important is that it set off a huge chain of reactions which resulted in the label hardening their stance on Mariah's public image. Mariah had been given the freedom to record an album that leaned heavily towards disco, soul, and not just commercial pop. Unfortunately, that attempt had failed in the eyes of the executives. For the next number of years, Mariah would be marketed as the Doris Day of the 1990s, non-threatening pop, almost like a 5-octave Disney princess.
I felt like I didn't fit into the boxes that people cut out for us to be put into so they can feel more comfortable.
However, the vocals would become more restrained, the success would become both enormous and global, and accusations of whitewashing would become even louder.
Can I sustain success?
Yeah.
If you get success and you have leverage, they'll get out of your way because you're making them a lot of money. But the minute you're not making them as much money, then they step in and they start playing these Jedi mind tricks on you. We know what to do. The public's going to forget about you. I mean, this kind of weird, like, yeah, you're in the room, but we're the arbiter of whether you can stay in the room.
It was during this creative tug of war Mariah's biggest selling record was released, the global juggernaut Music Box. selling approximately 30 million records. It became one of the biggest selling albums in history. While many of her previous efforts were successful in the US, this era saw platinum achievements in Europe. The album included one of her all-time signature songs, Hero, and one of her most celebrated covers, Without You. This album helped Carey to shapeshift from a budding superstar to a bona fide empress of music, and yet, Mariah has gone on to describe the album as schmaltzy, sequestered, whitewashed. Now, this isn't to deny the legitimate quality of Music Box, nor to dismiss the talent behind it, nor to misrepresent Mariah's feelings towards the record, a project she is proud of. However, Mariah's comments on the album expose the goal of this project, which was to push Mariah into the tidy, neat, middle-of-the-road category for monetary success, to create a non-threatening, safe, girl-next-door, fundamentally white artist, and not the mixed-race diverse woman Mariah really was. This is evident in the production of the lead single Dream Lover. Mariah collaborated with producer Dave Hall, which is significant as he was a fundamental figure in the production of Mary J. Blige's debut album, a revolutionary project that saw Blige frame her soulful vocals with a modern hip-hop beat. Mariah wanted to explore this creative innovation. She sought to incorporate an old-school sample to loop and become the backbone of Dream Lover. They chose Blind Alley, previously sampled in Big Daddy Kane's Ain't No Half Steppin'. On completion, Tommy Mottola, the head of Columbia Records, had mixed feelings and asked Walter to improve the song. Walter had co-written 4 songs with Mariah on her previous album, including the single Can't Let Go. His reworking of Dream Lover heavily altered how the sample was incorporated into the song, stating he had put a whole new shade of colours onto the track. Mariah's attempt at including a rapper were also squashed.
Dream Lover, which is it was slightly whitewashed, rather than, when we put the organ solo and all that. It's nostalgic, but I know that that's there because I wanted a rapper to be on that part, but nobody was ready for that. Yeah.
As a result, the gap between Mariah's artistic intentions and the final product became more of a chasm. This is a key example of the label wanting to smooth out Carey as she wanted to get a little more rough. The song Hero also comes from an artistic landscape that was somewhat disconnected to Mariah's authentic self. It was originally a track Mariah wrote for Gloria Estefan to be used as a movie soundtrack for the film Hero starring Dustin Hoffman. As Mariah writes in her memoir, Hero was written for a mainstream movie to be sung by a singer with a different style and a different range, and she felt the message and the melody was fairly generic.
I started having the with the words, because I was thinking of somebody else, I wasn't trying to write it in all kinds of like too high of a key or make it too intricate. So long I was like, okay, because it didn't take me a long time to write this song. It wasn't like a whole thing.
Columbia saw $signs when the demo was recorded and decided not only would Estefan not record the song, but that it would be released as part of Mariah's Music Box album. Now, as the decades have rolled by, Mariah has warmed to the song, particularly given the emotional attachment and the important moments in time she had performed the song. However, it's interesting that it was written from a somewhat cynical place. Reviews of the album mirrored this trepidatious perspective. The Los Angeles Times criticized the record, stating, "If you have an affection for soul, avoid this album," claiming its slick production was for listeners who liked their soul whitewashed and in small doses. Also in small doses were Mariah's soaring vocals, which were ubiquitous on her previous records. Many critics ridiculed Mariah's whistle notes and 5-octave range, leading to a more reserved vocal musicianship on Music Box, and yet, as a result, Christopher John Farley of Time criticized these pulled back vocals, accusing the record of being almost passionless. If I'm being honest, it often appeared that Mariah was damned if she did and damned if she didn't, a victim of recreational contrarianism of music critics. One substantial criticism, however, was from Mariah fans who worried she had championed her white heritage while squashing her black and Latin heritage for commercial gain, leading to tension in the media.
So I was 18 years old when I got my first record deal. A lot of very powerful men controlled my career, what I wore, who I worked with, and every aspect of my overall image. But, they could never understand or embrace the essence of who I truly am.
However, the public were ignorant to just how oppressive Columbia Records were in portraying Mariah as the Doris Day of 90s pop. Nevertheless, a soaring triumph for the album was Anytime You Need a Friend, a single that sold extremely well in Europe and showcased gospel-influenced vocals on Mariah. Overall, Mariah had entered an uncomfortable space. Yes, she had achieved eye-watering success, but it detoured from Mariah's personal vision. Mottola had become the powerful Svengali, lurking in the shadows, making Mariah just vanilla enough to achieve mass appeal, and yet he was deeply unaware of the urban revolution that was confidently knocking on his door, and that more importantly, his Disney princess would become the fantasy Trojan horse.
I think we really take for granted now, especially with streaming. There was a time when rock was rock and roll, pop music was pop music, R&B was R&B, hip hop was hip hop, and you didn't blur those lines. Certain radio stations wouldn't play hip hop. Mariah Carey, you made it cool for rappers to jump on R&B tracks, on pop tracks. You were one of the pioneers of this.
The pursuit by the label, and in particular Tommy Mottola, to mold Mariah into the clean Disney princess of 90s pop was unrelenting, and with the power he flaunted in the music industry and the control he exerted in his quote inappropriate relationship and marriage to Mariah Carey, the control was ubiquitous. Mariah's mixed race background was being systematically erased, just as her success was reaching global status.
So many people have always just gone like, oh, Mariah makes music that black people enjoy, everyone enjoys, but she's not black. People who you wanted to belong to sometimes didn't even know that you were part of the tribe.
Her third album, Music Box, not only soared in her native United States, it blew up in Europe, a territory that only saw sporadic impact in the past. And yet, the album was viewed by many as a sanitized, calculated version of the real Mariah. Plastic commercial soul. An interesting detour in Carey's career is her Christmas album of 1995. And in retrospect, the album was not just a festive gift for the season, but a gift in helping to actualize more candid creative endeavors. An important component of this record was the inclusion of gospel. Tommy Mottola appreciated jazz and gospel under certain circumstances. A Christmas album could exist independent to an album of original material. Inspired choirs and church-influenced sound was included on most tracks. Mariah also returned to her signature runs and riffs, absent on most of Music Box. Again, the label most likely allowed this because the Christmas album is an anomaly that could coexist outside the rules of branding Mariah as a safe pop singer. It is, after all, a Christian-orientated album, therefore church influences, and in Mariah's case, the Black Church, could shine brighter than they had on Music Box. Now, this soulful choice was met with mixed reviews. Some critics loved it, some critics once again complaining that Carey's vocals were over the top and narcissistic. However, many of these same journalists critiqued her lack of melisma on Music Box, highlighting their own lack of objectivity in the world of music critics. However, one review stands out from the Boston Globe, arguing that Carey had abandoned the overly polished sound of a previous record and cut loose with unbridled soul. Carey was making music she loved, not necessarily music that was commercially marketable. Because let's remind ourselves, pop stars rarely made albums at the peak of their career. As a result, one could argue that Merry Christmas was a precursor, a mental push for Carey in continuing to record material aligned to her own taste. In many ways, the authenticity in her Christmas music could be seen as a push towards authenticity in her music overall. And hip-hop was always at the root of Carey's musical core.
I was just trying to express myself. I grew up in New York. If you listen to the radio, you heard all these incredible hip-hop records. I wanted to incorporate those beats into records that I was making because that's what I liked. It was my personal taste.
However, to understand the ongoing opposition in allowing this to be included in her music, we need to look at the cultural context. in 1990.
See, this country was built on freedom of speech. If they want to sing whatever they sing, I may not like it, but I ain't got to buy it. I may not listen to it, but they have a right to sing it. You understand me? That's your right. Your freedom of being taken, stand up for it.
With the birth of rap, when NWA came along, they were like the Beatles in many ways. They changed the whole universe. Suddenly all the white kids were screaming, "F the police," you know? And that was very dangerous. The music industry is in fact afraid of music and the power that music has to change the world. So the industry worked very hard to silence rap.
Mariah states in her memoir that Mottola always wanted to wash the urban, translation black, off me. What started as an ironclad safety from her family became an ironclad dungeon. However, as controlling as the executives were, they could not control the tidal wave of youth culture. Just like Patti LaBelle, Whitney or Aretha Franklin were forced to adapt to the pop commercial 80s, record labels had to adapt to the urban 90s. The girl next door image was still utilised in #1 smashes like Always Be My Baby, or covers like Open Arms. However, with the inclusion of Boyz II Men on One Sweet Day or the Genius of Love sample on Fantasy, a new side of Mariah was beginning to gingerly emerge. However, it would be the remix to Fantasy that would shatter everything.
That one remix was responsible for, I would argue, an entire wave of music that we've seen since, and that is the pop hip-hop collaboration. You could argue that that Fantasy remix was the single most important recording that she ever.
Real, how did that even slide by? And I will say it here, complete racist. You don't say that. You know, you are black. You have every right. You are working also in a professional capacity. And I just felt like, nah.
I was so upset, and there was nobody came to my rescue at that point, but whatever, you know.
Look at these people who are now like, yes, this Black Lives Matters, but then let's really remember what you said, because those things will come back and haunt you.
Bernhardt belonged to a group who believed Mariah was exploiting her biracial identity to revamp her career, when in fact, she was finally free to pursue the sounds she wanted from day one. This underscores the lingering problem that Mariah had with the public, a simple lack of acceptance. Mariah's racial authenticity was always in question,